Clara woke before the sun, the same way she did every day. Her small cabin stood on the edge of the forest, far from the noise of the town. She lived alone, but she liked the quiet. The mornings were always peaceful, and she enjoyed walking to the creek to fetch fresh water. It reminded her that life, even in hard times, still carried a gentle rhythm. On this morning, though, something felt different. When she stepped outside, the air was strangely still, as if the forest was holding its breath. The sky was dark blue, waiting for sunrise. Clara carried her bucket and walked down the familiar path. She listened to the soft crunch of leaves under her boots, but she kept glancing around. She could not explain the feeling, but something inside her said the morning was not ordinary. As she reached the creek, she froze. Something moved near the brush on the opposite side. At first, she thought it was just a deer, but then she saw a man lying on the ground. He was face down, one arm stretched out toward the water. She set her bucket down quickly and ran toward him, her boots sinking slightly in the damp soil. When she reached him, she knelt beside him and gently turned him enough to see his face. He was pale, breathing slowly, and his eyes were closed. His dark coat was torn and dirt covered his clothes. But what shocked her most was the arrow. It was sticking out of his back, the wooden shaft jagged and dark with dried blood. For a moment, Clara could only stare. Her hands shook. She had seen injured animals before, but never a person wounded this badly. She didn't know who he was or what happened to him. But one thought filled her mind. If she left him here, he would die. She forced herself to stay calm and looked closer. On the side of his coat, something shiny caught her eye. She pushed the fabric aside and saw a badge. The words were scratched, but still readable. U.S. Marshal. Clara gasped softly. A marshal was someone who chased dangerous men, someone who risked his life to protect others. And now he was lying here, helpless. She pressed her fingers gently against his neck. His pulse was faint, but it was there. She touched his cheek and whispered, "Sir, can you hear me?" He didn't answer. Clara took a deep breath. She knew what she had to do. Even though she was not strong and the cabin was far, she couldn't leave him here. She placed her arms under his and tried to lift him. He was heavy, and the arrow made every movement risky. Clara moved slowly, careful not to bend the wound. Step by step, she dragged him across the ground. Her muscles burned, and she had to stop several times to rest. The sky slowly lightened, turning from blue to soft gray. Birds began to chirp, unaware of the struggle happening below them. Clara kept going, pulling the injured Marshal inch by inch toward her cabin by the time she reached her door. She was breathing heavily and shaking from exhaustion. She pushed the door open with her foot and dragged him inside. She laid him gently on the floor near the fireplace. The room was warm. It was filled with the faint smell of herbs she kept drying on the shelves. Clara hurried to get blankets and placed them under his head. She fetched water, towels, and the small box of medical supplies she kept for emergencies. When she returned to him, she studied the arrow again. She knew enough to understand that pulling it out fully would do more harm. She had to break the shaft first. Her hands trembled at the thought, but leaving it as it was could kill him. She whispered again, "I'm sorry for the pain this will cause." Though he was unconscious, she felt that saying the words mattered. Clara placed a cloth between her hands, gripped the arrow's wooden shaft carefully. With one quick, firm motion, she snapped it. The sound made her heart jump, but the Marshal did not move. She breathed out slowly and cleaned as much of the wound as she could without removing the embedded part. She washed the dried blood, wiped the dirt from his back, and covered the injury with clean cloth. She worked for a long time. Her fingers moved gently, but her eyes were full of worry. She wondered what happened to him. Who shot him? Why was he near her home? The arrow looked handmade, something used by trackers or men who hunted people. The thought made her uneasy. If someone did this to a lawman, they were dangerous. And they might still be nearby. After she finished cleaning the wound, she lifted his coat aside to see if he had any other injuries. That was when he stirred for the first time. Clara froze. His hand twitched and he let out a soft groan. She leaned closer. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. just slightly. They were a deep, tired blue. He blinked slowly, clearly struggling to stay conscious. His voice came out rough and weak. He whispered one word. "Where?" "You're safe," Clara said softly. "You're in my cabin. I found you by the creek." He blinked again, trying to understand. His breathing was shallow and uneven. He lifted his hand slightly but lowered it again, too weak to move. Clara offered him water, lifting his head gently so he could sip a small amount. After swallowing, he seemed to gather a little strength. His voice was barely more than a breath when he spoke again. "Are they here?" Clara frowned gently. "Who?" He tried to turn his head, wincing from the pain. "Men. Bounty hunters." The words sent a chill through her. She had heard stories about bounty hunters, men who tracked people for money, often hired by outlaw gangs. If they were hunting the Marshal, they were likely armed and dangerous, and if he escaped, they were probably looking for him. Clara swallowed hard. "No one has come here yet," she answered quietly. "But if someone is searching for you, I need to know what to expect." The Marshal tried to speak again, but the pain was too strong. His eyes closed slowly as he lost consciousness once more. Clara sat back on her heels, troubled. She didn't know all the details, but she understood enough. The Marshal was in real danger, and by helping him, she had placed herself in that danger as well. But when she looked at him lying there, weak and helpless, she knew she couldn't change her decision. She would not abandon him. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the forest. The sky was brighter now, the first hints of dawn spreading across the land. The air looked calm, but Clara felt a heavy tension. She listened for horses, voices, or footsteps. So far, there was nothing unusual. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this peace would not last. She returned to the Marshal and checked his breathing again. It was still slow, but steady. She adjusted the blanket around his shoulders and added more wood to the fire. The warmth filled the room, chasing away the night's cold. Clara sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap. She wondered what kind of man he was. He looked strong, even while unconscious. His clothes were worn from long travel, and his boots were covered in dust. His hands were rough, the hands of someone used to work in danger. But his face, though tired, held a kind expression. She imagined what he must have gone through before collapsing near her home. Maybe he had been riding through the night, chased by those bounty hunters. Maybe he had been fighting to protect someone else. The arrow in his back told a story of struggle, and the badge on his coat told a story of duty. Clara spent the next hour watching over him. She checked his temperature, replaced the cloth on his wound, and made sure he could breathe comfortably. She moved quietly, careful not to wake him. Every small sound outside made her look toward the door. She didn't know if she was being careful or afraid. The sun finally rose, filling the cabin with soft golden light. It made everything look warmer except the fear in Clara's heart. She stepped outside for a moment, just to breathe fresh air. She scanned the trees, listening. The forest was waking up, full of morning sounds. Birds chirped, and the breeze moved through the branches. For a moment, she almost felt safe, but then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Faint. Far away, but unmistakable. Her heart dropped. She rushed back inside, closed the door quietly, and turned to the Marshal. He was still unconscious, unaware of the danger approaching. Clara knelt beside him and whispered, "You're not alone. I'll keep you safe." She meant the words, even though she did not know how she would protect him. She only knew she couldn't let those men find him here. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing through the valley. The morning peace was gone. Clara looked at the door, fear tightening her chest. She took a deep breath and forced herself to stay steady. She had no idea what would happen next. But she knew her life was about to change. The sound of hoofbeats grew clearer as the morning sun spread across the hills. Clara stood near the door, her hand resting on the wooden frame as she listened. Each beat felt heavier than the last, as if the danger itself was approaching step by step. She looked back at the wounded Marshal lying on the floor. His breathing was still slow, and his face was pale. He was in no condition to move or defend himself. Clara took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She had not planned for any of this. She was just a woman living a quiet life in a small cabin. But now, without choosing it, she was responsible for a man hunted by dangerous people. She reminded herself of one thing: she had saved his life, and she would not let anyone take it away. The hoofbeat stopped just outside her cabin. Clara's heart jumped. She stepped away from the door and quickly covered the Marshal with an extra blanket, hiding the badge on his coat. She whispered, "Please stay quiet. Please rest." Even though he was unconscious, she felt he could hear her. A loud knock echoed through the cabin. "Open up." A rough voice called, "We just want to talk." Clara froze, then forced herself to breathe slowly. She wiped her hands on her apron, steadied her voice, and walked to the door. She opened it only a few inches, just enough to look outside. 3 men sat on horses in front of her cabin. They were dusty, tired-looking, and armed. Their coats were long, and their hats were pulled low over their eyes. One man held a rolled-up paper which Clara guessed was a wanted poster. All 3 stared at her with sharp, searching eyes. "Morning, ma'am," the man in front said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were cold. "We're looking for someone." "A wounded man." "Passed through these woods last night?" Clara shook her head slowly. "I haven't seen anyone," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I've been here all morning." The man on the left leaned forward slightly. "We saw tracks near the creek, footprints. Someone dragged themselves, or someone else." "You sure you haven't seen anything strange?" Clara felt her stomach twist, but she kept her face calm. "I fetched water early. I didn't see anyone there." The man holding the paper narrowed his eyes. "You live alone out here?" "Yes," Clara answered. "I don't get many visitors." The leader nodded slowly. "Mind if we look around? The man we're after is dangerous. We're trying to stop him before he harms someone." Clara swallowed. She didn't want to let them near the cabin, but if she refused, their suspicion would grow. She forced herself to smile lightly. "You can look around outside. There's nothing inside but my things." The men exchanged glances. The leader nodded. "All right, boys. Check the area." Clara stepped onto the porch to keep an eye on them. The 2 riders on the sides dismounted and began searching. One walked around the shed, kicking at the dirt and looking for signs. The other studied the ground near the fence, nudging it with his boot. Clara stood still, watching carefully, feeling her heart beat faster with every step they took. The leader stayed near her, still on his horse. He studied her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "Strange morning, isn't it?" he said casually. "Yes," Clara replied quietly. "Strange indeed. You sure you didn't hear anything last night? Voices? Horses?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "Just the wind. I sleep early." The leader hummed softly, not convinced. "The man we're looking for is a Marshal. One stubborn fella, tough. Even wounded, he could still be crawling around somewhere." Clara felt her throat tighten. She forced her voice to sound confused. "A Marshal? Why would a Marshal be out here?" The leader stared at her for a long moment. Maybe asking questions to the wrong people. That's how trouble starts. Before Clara could answer, the man searching the creek trail shouted, "Boss, found something." Her chest tightened. She followed the leader with her eyes as he rode toward the man calling him. Clara stayed on the porch, gripping the railing so tightly her fingers turned white. The 2 men crouched near the trail that led to her cabin. Clara could not hear their words, but she could see concern on their faces. One pointed at the ground, the other at the trees. Then the leader looked up toward her cabin, his eyes narrowing. Clara's heartbeat thundered in her ears. The men approached her again. The leader stopped in front of her door. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "those are blood drops down there. Fresh ones. We ain't saying it came from here, but it's close." Clara forced herself to breathe. "I don't know anything about that," she replied. "Maybe an animal was hurt." The leader tilted his head slightly. "Maybe, but we're going to take a look inside your cabin." Clara's breath caught. She couldn't let them inside. The Marshal was lying just out of sight, weak and bleeding. She had to think quickly. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Please, sir. This is my home. There's nothing in there. I'm just a widow trying to live quietly." The leader's face softened just a little, but not enough. "We won't touch anything. Just want to be sure." "Step aside." Clara felt her heart drop. She stepped closer to the door, blocking it more firmly. "I told you there's no one inside." The leader stared at her for a long, tense moment. She felt his sharp gaze trying to pierce through her calm expression. She prayed silently that he would give up. Before he could answer, a sudden sound echoed from deeper in the woods. A horse neighed loudly, followed by a startled cry from one of the bounty hunters exploring the farther trees. All three men turned sharply. One shouted, "Someone's running through the trees." Could be him? The leader snapped his reins and yelled, "Move! Spread out!" Without another word, the bounty hunters mounted their horses and rode toward the woods, dust rising behind them. Clara stood frozen, watching them disappear among the tall trees. When the last echo of hoofbeats faded, she finally let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her knees felt weak. She leaned against the porch railing, trying to steady herself. She could hardly believe they were gone, at least for now. Clara hurried back into the cabin and shut the door behind her. She turned to look at the Marshal. He had not moved. His chest rose and fell slowly, his face still pale. She hurried to his side. "I think they believed the noise," she whispered, touching his forehead gently. "But they'll come back. I know they will." The Marshal stirred slightly. His eyes opened halfway. He looked at her with confusion, trying to understand what had happened. "They were here," Clara explained softly. "The men who were searching for you. But they didn't find you." "Not yet." He tried to speak, but his voice was too weak. Clara placed a hand on his arm. "Don't talk. Save your strength." But the Marshal shook his head slightly. He needed her to understand. He took a shallow breath and whispered, "You? In danger." Clara shook her head firmly. "I'll be fine. Right now, you are the one who needs help." His eyes softened with worry, but he didn't have the strength to argue. Clara gave him a small sip of water, then adjusted the blanket around him. She added another log to the fire, wanting the room to stay warm. She saw fear in his eyes, fear that she was doing too much for him and risking herself. She sat down beside him. "I made a choice," she whispered. "I won't turn away from someone who needs me." The Marshal blinked slowly, as if her words reached deeper than she realized. He closed his eyes again. Exhausted, Clara stayed by his side for a long time, listening to the quiet inside the cabin and the faint sounds outside. She knew the bounty hunters would return. They were experienced trackers, and they would not give up easily. She had to decide what to do soon. One thought kept returning to her mind. She needed to hide him better. Clara rose, walked around the cabin, and studied each corner. The small space offered very few hiding places. But then, she remembered something: her cellar. It was small, and usually used to store jars and dry food. But it might give the Marshal more safety than lying in plain view. She returned to him, gently touched his shoulder, and whispered, "I'm going to move you. I know it will hurt, but it's the only way to keep you safe." He opened his eyes again, trying to understand. His voice was thin. "Why? Helping." Clara looked at him with soft determination. "Because it's right," she said simply. "Because you didn't deserve what happened to you. And because no one should face danger alone." A faint expression of gratitude passed across his face. She started clearing the area around the cellar entrance. When everything was ready, she stepped back to the Marshal and carefully lifted him with all the strength she had. He winced softly, but she kept whispering comforting words. Inch by inch, she moved him to the cellar opening. Guiding him down slowly and gently, she placed blankets, water, and a small lantern beside him. She promised to stay close. "This is only for a short time," she said, "just until the danger passes." The Marshal tried to nod, showing he understood. His eyes followed her for a moment, full of trust. Before closing again to rest, Clara covered the cellar entrance with a rug and placed a wooden crate on top to make it look natural. She stood in the cabin, breathing heavily. Her heart was still pounding, but she felt more in control now. She knew this wasn't the end. The bounty hunters would return, and she had to be ready. She walked to the window. The sun was fully risen now, shining across the forest. She could see dust settling where the bounty hunters had ridden off. They were searching the woods, spreading out, looking for any sign. Clara closed her eyes and whispered a quiet promise to herself. She would protect the Marshal until he could protect himself. She had no plan beyond that, but she trusted her courage and her instincts. The cabin grew quiet again after Clara hid the Marshal in the cellar. The morning sun had risen fully now, sending long beams of warm light across the room. But even with sunlight, the fear in Clara's heart did not fade. She kept walking to the window and checking the forest lines, expecting the bounty hunters to return at any moment. Inside the cellar, the Marshal lay still, trying his best to stay conscious. He could hear faint footsteps above him, Clara moving around, preparing, watching, making sure he was safe. Though he could not see her, he knew she was doing everything she could for him. He felt a mixture of gratitude and worry. He had spent his life protecting people, yet now he lay helpless, being protected by someone who should never have been dragged into danger. Clara moved quietly, but her mind raced. She needed a plan. The bounty hunters were skilled trackers. They would not give up easily, not when they believed the Marshal was close. She went to the small shelf near the window, grabbed her old rifle, and checked it carefully. It was clean and ready, but she knew she was not an expert. Still, she would use it if she had to. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it, but her eyes were steady. She set the rifle beside the door and took a long breath. "I can do this," she whispered to herself. "Just stay calm." Hours passed slowly. Clara listened to the distant echoes of voices and the occasional neighing of horses. The bounty hunters were searching, moving through the hills, checking the creek, circling around. Each sound made her stop and hold her breath. But she didn't leave the cabin. She had promised the Marshal she would protect him. She meant every word. Around midday, Clara quietly opened the cellar door to check on him. The Marshal opened his eyes slightly, though he looked exhausted. She knelt beside him and offered a cup of water. He took a small sip, then rested his head again. "The men. Still here?" he whispered. Clara nodded slightly. "They're searching the area, but they didn't find you. You're safe for now." He tried to speak more, but the effort caused pain. Clara gently placed a hand on his arm. "Don't talk. You need rest." The Marshal closed his eyes, trusting her completely. Clara returned upstairs and checked the windows again. The forest seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. She knew from stories that trackers often moved silently when they got close. The stillness outside made her even more cautious. She decided to step out onto the porch to listen better. She opened the door quietly and stood just outside, the warm breeze brushing across her face. The air smelled fresh, but Clara felt the tension underneath it. She looked toward the distant ridge and froze. Dust. A faint cloud rising between the trees. Hoofbeats followed a slow, steady rhythm, like men riding carefully, trying not to make noise. "They're coming back," Clara whispered. She stepped back inside and closed the door gently. She grabbed the rifle and held it close. She didn't want to use it. She didn't want to fight. But she would not allow anyone to harm the Marshal. The hoofbeats grew louder. Voices traveled through the trees as the bounty hunters talked among themselves. Clara heard one say, "He's near." "I know it. Tracks lead this way." Another replied, "That woman lied earlier. She's hiding something." Clara's heartbeat quickened. They were suspicious again. She backed away from the door, steadying her breathing. A knock thundered against the wood, stronger than before. "Open up," the leader's voice shouted. This time, "We're looking inside." Clara held the rifle tightly and moved toward the door. She opened it slowly. The leader and his 2 men sat on their horses, sweat on their brows, dust on their coats. "They looked more determined than earlier, ma'am," the leader said, his tone firm. "Step aside. We found fresh tracks behind your cabin. Someone injured was dragged. You're hiding him." Clara felt fear grip her, but she also felt a strange courage rise inside her. She stepped forward instead of backward. "No one is here," she said, her voice steady. "You are mistaken." The leader narrowed his eyes. We're past polite talk. Move. Clara's grip on the rifle tightened. She knew she had no right to threaten them, and she hoped she wouldn't have to. But she stood her ground. I said no. For a moment, there was silence. The three hunters stared at her, surprised by her sudden courage. Then one of them grinned slightly. This ain't gonna go well for you, ma'am. Before he could dismount, a sound broke the tension. A quiet click from inside the cabin. It was the sound of a gun hammer being cocked. The men stiffened. Clara didn't move. She knew that sound didn't come from her rifle. They all turned their eyes toward the cabin interior. The Marshal had climbed halfway out of the cellar hatch. His face was pale, his body shaking from pain and weakness. But he held Clara's spare revolver in one hand, aimed clearly at the door. His voice was soft but steady enough to carry. She's not alone, he said. The bounty hunters stiffened with surprise. They had not expected a wounded man to regain strength or raise a weapon. The leader's eyes hardened. Marshal Ward, he said slowly. Didn't expect you to be awake. Looks like you brought this woman into trouble. The Marshal breathed heavily, but didn't lower the gun. Leave her out of this? Clara's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected him to climb out of the cellar. She rushed to his side to support him, worried he might collapse. But the Marshal kept the weapon raised, refusing to show weakness. The leader frowned. We just want you, Marshal. Hand yourself over and we won't trouble the lady. The Marshal stared at him. You don't want to take me in. You want to collect a reward by delivering me to the men I put behind bars. The hunters didn't deny it. Their silence told the truth. Clara stepped closer to the Marshal, steadying him. She whispered, You shouldn't have stood up. You're hurt, he whispered back. I can't let them near you. The situation grew heavy again as all three bounty hunters tensed, hands near their holsters, eyes locked on the Marshal. Clara's breath came fast. The air felt thick. Then the Marshal spoke, louder this time. Last chance. Right away. The leader smirked slightly. We're three men. You can barely stand. Clara raised her rifle. Her hands were trembling, but she pointed it firmly. He's not alone, she said, repeating his words with quiet courage. The hunters didn't laugh. Clara's voice was too steady, her eyes too determined. She had changed since the first time they visited. She was no longer the frightened widow hiding behind her door. She was protecting someone with all her heart. The leader looked from her to the Marshal, then back at her again. Finally, he sighed. This ain't worth it. Not today. He turned his horse. The other two hesitated. One muttered, Boss, we're letting them go? The leader looked over his shoulder. He ain't going far in this condition. And she's more trouble than she looks. We'll find him later. Somewhere easier. With that, he flicked his reins, and the three men rode off slowly. They didn't hurry. They didn't run. But they left, disappearing into the forest. Clara watched them until the last horse vanished behind the trees. Only then did she let her breath slip out in a long, shaking exhale. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned on the table for support. The Marshal lowered the revolver, his hand trembling. Clara rushed to him as his knees buckled, and she guided him back to the cellar edge. But he shook his head. No. Couch, he whispered. I can stay up now. With your help. She helped him to the small couch near the fireplace. He sank into the cushions, exhausted but relieved. Clara sat beside him and checked his wound again. His breathing was uneven, but the bleeding hadn't started again. He looked at her with tired but grateful eyes. You stood up to them, he said softly. You saved my life. Clara shook her head gently. You saved it too? They would have forced their way in if you hadn't stood up. The Marshal smiled faintly. We saved each other then. Clara felt warmth fill her chest. The danger was not completely gone, but the worst had passed. For now, the cabin felt safe again. The sunlight reached across the floor, gentle and calm. Clara sat beside the Marshal for a long time, making sure he rested comfortably. Finally, he spoke again. When I heal, I'll fix this. I'll clear the danger. You won't have to be afraid anymore. Clara gave a small, warm smile. You don't owe me anything. The Marshal shook his head. I owe you my life. The room grew quiet again. Clara looked at the peaceful forest through the window. The danger had left, but something else had arrived, a bond she had never expected. A wounded Marshal. A brave widow. A morning that changed everything, and their story had only just begun.